So tonight we're going to talk about Blake, which is great because he comes in and out of our conversations, and you've got plenty of expertise, I think, now in the subject. And in particular, we're going to talk about a recent book on the question of Blake. And I've been making notes on your review of the book, which is a 20,000 word review. So, you've written a fifth of a book on the book itself. So well done. But I haven't read the actual book. And I don't think that is a problem for what I want to talk about, because I actually want to use this conversation as a jumping off, use your critique of the book as a jumping off opportunity to go into, and I've broken it down. There's 5 topics I want to discuss tonight with you on the basis of this review. Sorry, the original book is...
So the original book is, it's by John Higgs, and it's called William Blake versus the World.
Right. So the book, actually 3, 2, 1. So the book is John Higgs, William Blake versus the World. But for me, what's interesting is the way in which you approach some of these the critiques. And that's what I want to explore tonight. So I hope that anyone listening in to us will feel the same, that there's some fertile ideas in the way you're arguing the book, and we don't necessarily have to read the book to appreciate them. So I'm going to jump in with number 1 of 5. And number 1 of 5 is, you describe Blake as having radical otherness. Okay, so Blake is coming to us with such a strange worldview, such an alien construction of what's going on, that it raises the question, how do we enter into his world? And this is interesting to me because, of course, it doesn't just apply to Blake. When you encounter anybody who has got a very radical alternative model, and most of us don't, okay, because we've all grown up in a global capitalist culture that has, homogenized thought. So when you encounter someone who's outside of that way of thinking, how on earth can you understand them? What, you're going to encounter them, and you're going to filter it through your your culture, the way you've been brought up and everything. You're not going to understand them. So that's my first question to you. How can anybody understand a radical other?
Well, we're all, it's an excellent question, but the answer, a definitive answer, would be quite long-winded, but it's premised on the fact that, we can understand one another because we're historically situated, and we have needs and ambitions, and our social connections are not that different to Blake's of a few hundred years ago. It's not that he's not living in a Neolithic era or something like that. But the problem is that he comes from a culture that's occluded within our culture. So T.S. Eliot said about Blake that he was amazing, he was special because he had no culture, is the way Eliot put it. So the praise being, the implied praise being that Blake had to make everything up. It's not like he was a high sort of Anglican or Catholic or something, in a mainstream tradition like that. So he had to make everything up. And T.S. Eliot, in a way, is trying to praise him, saying, he had no culture. Therefore, he was a genius because he had to make it all up. But I've always been offended by that idea, because I believe deeply that Blake absolutely had a culture. But again, it's one that's been was occluded even in his own time. He was old-fashioned in his own time in some ways, because he's a product of of dissenting religious currents, yes, of dissenting thought, if you sort of almost what we would now call a sort of bohemianism. But the philosophical ideas of people like Jacob Boehm and people like that. But he was essentially a sort of antinomian enthusiast. And enthusiasm in politics and religion is something that we don't really understand anymore. So that is a definite culture. And my belief is that, that it's a long-running culture and it's existed for centuries, if not more, but it's largely been underground. It's largely, I keep using the word occluded to sound posh, but it's largely a culture that's been occluded historically because it's a peasant antinomian culture. And so just by the way of things, Blake's way of thinking, that whole way of thinking, not just to do with Blake, is hidden from history, one. And therefore, it's, as you say, it's extremely difficult if you come across it now. Well, it doesn't make Blake hard to assimilate. It makes him hard to understand. He's actually easy to assimilate, which is why he gets assimilated differently by everybody who looks at him. There are as many Blakes as there are critics of Blake. So there's a Jungian Blake. There's the brain bilateral, left and right brain Blake. There's a whole school of thought around that. There's a Neoplatonist Blake. So everyone, all the different Blakean groups that exist, all have a different reading of Blake. And I think it's like the proverbial, men just trying to describe an elephant. Some of them are touching the ears, some touch the tail, but none of them could see the whole thing. The problem of understanding Blake is to see the whole thing, and to see that, for example, a lot of these modern interpreters and fans, say the Neoplatonist types, they don't register his politics in a way. They treat it almost as an embarrassment. But I think the reason for that is not because Blake combined religion and politics and this and that, like a list of interests that he had, but that his worldview is just inherently religious and political at the same time. This hard to understand worldview. One of the things that's hard to understand about it is that politics for him isn't an adjunct to everyday life. And one of the things that John Higgs says in his book is that Blake wasn't really political because he never joined a political party or campaigned for a candidate. And not only is that just historically sort of illiterate, because mass parties didn't exist in Blake's time, but it also doesn't understand the way that politics is more than just professional politics.
I just part that there because that's my number 5 is actually the politics of Blake. Staying on the radical otherness, then. Well, there's a quote. I think it is in Higgs' book, but it could be from you in your review. It's a great quote. It's from the neurosurgeon Eben Alexander III, and he says, so he had an out-of-body experience I think it was under surgery, and when he recovered, he said it was like now trying to explain my experience is like a chimpanzee becoming human for a single day to experience all the wonders of human knowledge, and then returning to one's chimp friends and trying to tell them about the calculus and the immense scale of the universe. So he just couldn't do it. It's such a dramatically different world that he briefly experienced. And that brought home to me the scale of the challenge if we're, if what you're saying about Blake's to be believed. And it also made me think, well, okay, so how did you do it? So, I know that you've reached a point where you're sort of decoding the archetypes, and you're getting more and more informed about them by Blake. But where did it all begin? What entry points did you have into that world, you personally?
That actually is difficult to answer, not biographically, because biographically, I engaged with Blake because I read some Blake, the same as a lot of people do. But then in the AMM, the Association of Musical Marxists, the group I used to be part of, we published a book partly on Blake by Ben Watson. And it led to quite a lot of discussion of Blake in the group and what he really stood for. There's quite a falling out in the group, which I don't need to go into details about, but it's centered around this argument to do with Blake. And that reminded me, so I re-engaged with Blake at that point in order to, take part in this argument or whatever. But the main thing, a bit frustrating for you because it's not such a clear answer, but the main thing I realized in Blake was that there was something immense going on there that I actually couldn't put my finger on. So I fell in love with Blake in a way, or I became deeply, deeply persuaded that something very profound was happening in his thought through obviously myriads of hints in his work and the strangeness of it, but the form of that strangeness. He was very attractive to me as a person because, partly because, you know, he was an artisanal type. He was a maker. He wasn't a university man. He hated the universities, the academics, the Royal Academy, the establishment. He was always outside of that. But he was, at the same time, he was really fiercely independent and fiercely believed in himself and in his worldview. And these are all just tremendously attractive things to me. But then scratch away, what is that worldview? Some of it is obvious. I mean, in the sense of whatever you make of it, there's clearly a connection with the dissenting religious and political traditions, clearly a connection with the left wing of the English Civil War.
But like, you know, how did you know that it was the real deal and not, you know, fraud? So I want to be able to discover things worth reading, people worth engaging with. And Blake sounds like a good candidate for this. Can you think more precisely what it was no,
I can think what the mechanism was, but you know, I still don't understand Blake in many crucial ways, even in some superficial ones. To be honest, there's a lot to find out. But there is the idea. Coleridge talks about a sort of teleology and your own spiritual development. And when you recognise, I can't remember, he uses a metaphor from nature and the development of a chrysalis. I think it's a moth developing out of a pupa, but in a particular moth, it has to make space for the wings that are going to develop later, or something like that. And using that as a metaphor, he sort of says, well, how do you know that you need to make that space? Yeah. How do you know what's going to come next? We don't know, but any really serious person recognizes that in their life when they see, you know, sort of game on. There's something. Yeah. And I felt that very deeply with Blake, more than anybody. And I've been an enthusiast, to borrow a term, for quite a number of thinkers and things over the years. But with Blake, I felt a very, very, very deep attraction to it, partly to him as a man, you know, partly. But overwhelmingly to the imagery that he used. If you read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, you know, there's clearly something profoundly dialectical and other going on, which pointed him towards radical social ideas as well as profound, you know, spiritual ideas, and that seemed highly attractive to me. You know, I'd go further than that and say I knew that if I got to the bottom of Blake, I would make a massive breakthrough into something I really needed to understand. But I can't justify that. But
No, it's interesting. Okay, that was question one. Number two is how should we read Songs of Innocence and Experience? Because John Higgs seems to read them quite literally, and you sort of take him to task on the Chimney Sweep Song of Innocence and then the Chimney Sweep Song of Experience. And I actually think it's worth me reading them out. So if you bear with me, because then what I want you to explain is how you read them, because I liked the way you argued it, and it was convinced me that they should be seen, well, understood in a particular way, which I'll invite you to say, but just for the benefit of those listeners who, you know, wouldn't have it to hand. So this is the Song of Innocence, the Chimney Sweep. An angel appears and unlocks the coffins, freeing the boys, and then we get these lines. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our bushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. It's very sweet. And, you know, Higgs pours a bit of scorn on that, I think. And then the Chimney Sweep, this is the Song of Experience, its kind of counterpart. Because I was happy upon the heath, and smiled among the winter's snow, that clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I'm happy and dance and sing, they think they've done me no injury and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. Brilliant.
Yeah, the context is that John Higgs was arguing about these particular poems. So perhaps for a wider context here, the Songs of Innocence and Experience were Blake's blockbuster seller in his own lifetime. I think he sold 30 or 40 copies. Talking about handmade, but they were his big seller. But they're also, in many ways, apart from the poem Jerusalem, from the introduction to Milton, which is sung as people know, almost an alternate national anthem now. You know, did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's green and pleasant land? But apart from that, some of the poems from Songs of Innocence and Experience that Blake is best known by. So in fact, the most anthologized poem in the English language apparently is The Tiger, by Blake, which is from those collections. And they're quite simple poems, ostensibly. Now, I once went to a reading group, for a study group over a period of months, where we went through the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And when I say they're ostensibly simple, you know, I say that deliberately because actually it's like staring into a hall of mirrors. They are full of paradoxes, indirection, contradictions, and they're very, very deep poems, despite almost being like children's songs. It's believed that many of them would have been sung by Blake. He was a great singer, and he liked to take popular tunes and maybe tunes of his own and sing songs to them. So he would perhaps have sung these as songs, ostensibly simple, as I say. But they are attempts to grapple with and describe what he calls two contrary states of the soul, the state of innocence and the state of experience. So when you look at these poems, there's a lot of mirroring goes on. First of all, the Songs of Innocence was published separately, and later on he published the Songs of Experience, and then he published them together. But within that, there's a lot of mirroring happens. So there are poems that reflect one another. The Chimney Sweep appears twice. There are two poems called The Chimney Sweep, one of them in the Songs of Innocence, one in Songs of Experience. But then you get mirrorings like there's the poem The Little Girl Lost and the Little Girl Found, and the Little Boy Lost and the Little Boy Found. You get in Innocence, you get the lamb, you know, who made thee, little lamb, and then in Experience you get the tiger.
Yeah,
these are mirror poems. So there's so much mirroring going on, and so much, as I say, indirection. They're extremely complex. And Higgs chose to describe these poems as Blake's Yellow Submarine, i.e., you know, they were very, in the way he described it was, you know, in the same way that Yellow Submarine is obviously a Beatles song, and yet it's not representative of what the Beatles really are. And I thought that was a terrible mistake, because he'd confused the ostensible simplicity of the poems with their amazing depth. I mean, you could study them forever and still not get to the bottom of them. And in this particular case, he took the poem The Chimney Sweep from Songs of Innocence, in which, you know, all the chimney sweeps are locked up in their black coffins, as he puts it, you know, the chimneys that they work in. And the angel promises them that if they behave and if they do well, you know, that God will look after them. And, you know, first of all, there's a context to this in itself, which is that the plight of chimney sweeps was being discussed in Parliament, you know, at the time or not long before Blake wrote this poem. And there was a great discussion about it, where Liberals were trying to get the age which the sweeps were put to work increased. But it didn't succeed in Parliament, and there was quite a scandal about it, you know. So Blake wasn't in any way naive when he's writing this. But Higgs says precisely that he was naive. He said this is the point of view of innocence, which Blake later came to reject. So the idea is that it's quite a strange idea when you think about it. The idea is that Blake was innocent and naive, And he wrote a lot of poems from an innocent and naive point of view and published them with the title Songs of Innocence, as if he knew that he was naive. and obviously that's absurd, because he wasn't at all naive. He reflects the state of innocence. That state of innocence is one in which you may believe, even as a chimney sweep, that God is going to look after you. Plenty of chimney sweeps possibly believe that ultimately. I don't know. But that state of innocence is not naivety on Blake's part. And he certainly, at that time, he was a radical. He certainly didn't believe that the church and God was going to look after chimney sweeps. There's literally no chance of that, which is what makes this reading so odd. But it's not really a point about Blake, because that's really a point about poetry. If you read poetry, one of the most obvious mistakes you could make is to assume that what's said in the poem is the view of the author. It's not. There are characters there. And if that is true of poetry generally, I would say it's 10 times more true of Blake, even in Songs of Innocence and Experience, which are ostensibly simple but have that depth. Later on, in Jerusalem and his great poems, it becomes massively more so, more complex. But what Higgs does is just makes that really. It's a mistake that would make you fail your O levels, basically. To read the poetry that naively. But I don't want to be mean about that with him, because I don't think it is an important mistake. And it becomes typical of the way that Higgs reads Blake as a whole. But it's worth saying, if you're going to buy that book and read it, it's worth pointing out that it is nonsense to imagine that Blake started off with innocent, naive political beliefs and then became more sophisticated.
Yeah, but I actually want to steer you to something else, which is that your understanding, and I was persuaded of it, is of especially the Songs of Experiences, that Blake is trying to give the reader an experience.
He's trying to make the reader familiar with a state of mind, a state of being, a state of existence, or one of innocence, by making it familiar to you through poetry. But it's not it's not like rote learning. He's not defining innocence so that you can later on in an exam define it, in that style. It's like getting you to feel what innocence is like. And one of the things I felt, I don't know, I haven't done a survey about this, but I would imagine that any reasonably sensitive reader, when they read the chimney sweep in the Innocence, and it says, what does it say exactly, Conor?
If all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Yeah. I mean, that's a chilling line. That's just awful.
And what came to my mind was when you watch a horror film, and you see the innocent people wandering about the dark, abandoned house, but you also see the killer in the shadows waiting for them, and it's like hearing one of those people mouth to say, "Oh, this seems like a nice place." As a viewer or as a reader of the poem, you understand that this is quite horrifying situation, and that the situation. I mean, you have to be careful how you articulate these things, because Blake is also not putting words into the mouths of the chimney sweeps either. He's not trying to tell you verbatim what chimney sweeps believe either. But nevertheless, he's trying to give you a sense of what that state of innocence is like, and you must feel that tension. But apparently, John Higgs didn't feel that tension. He really thought that Blake was just writing down what he thought, that that if you do your duty, all will be well. But clearly, that's nonsense. I mean, in a way, it's a cheap shot, really, because that's such a dreadful analysis of the poem that I couldn't resist pointing out that if you're going to write a book about Blake, and without going off topic here, throughout the course of most of the book, Higgs uses particular lines from the poetry to illustrate points that he wants to make, but he doesn't really analyze any of it as poetry. So in that sense, what he did in this case is typical. I basically would say he wasn't really reading it as poetry. And it's true that Blake was multifaceted as an artist, but not to understand how to read poetry is going to give you pretty serious problems in understanding Blake overall, which I think this chap Higgs gets into.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on. But I think it makes me want to reread them all, the way you discuss them, and as experiences, as like you just said, they're states of mind, but to be in the moment more.
We discussed this when we were talking about Bateson a few weeks ago, and Bateson talked about states of mind or aspects of consciousness that weren't, verbal, rationalistic, whatever. But he called them intelligent. If you recall, they're just as intelligent as rational states of mind. And he used all kinds of examples. But the state of innocence would be one of those things. It's not a formulation or it's not a belief that you have.
Yeah.
It's a state of mind, and he's getting you familiar with it, as he does with states of experience. And it's important to remember too, he calls them contrary states of the soul. It's important to remember that Blake sees life as existing through the struggle between contraries, which also means that he didn't abandon innocence for experience as well.
Yeah.
They're not alternatives in that sense.
Okay, now the third topic I wanted to discuss was, and correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Beulah. Beulah?
Oh, Beulah. Beulah. Yeah.
Beulah. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a concept I'm not that familiar with, but it's, for Blake, there's a sort of primordial, chaotic realm, which serves him a lot in his apparently in his construction of his theology. And in the book for Higgs, this is exciting because it connects Blake to modern science, to ideas about the quantum realm, but it also allows him to connect to Tao, and which we had a good discussion about. So that there's this kind of I'm inviting you to be a little bit contemptuous here, because what it does is, according to your review anyway, it allows Higgs to be very eclectic, pulling this kind of quantum physics, spiritual dialectics. It kind of, you can take what you like once you've got this creative zone, but that's what he thinks Beulah is about in Blake. So you wanted to, first of all, you wanted to take on this particular translation. So this is the translation you are not too happy with. The Tao can't be perceived, smaller than an electron. It contains uncountable galaxies. And you quite rightly say, in the 5th century BC, they're not going to be talking about electrons and galaxies. So that there's a big artistic license in the translator's translation there, and therefore Higgs is really, he's joining dots that aren't really there to join. So I'd like you to explain your understanding of Beulah, and then why it doesn't work to say that it's connected to the modern ideas of quantum physics.
There's a couple of separate issues going on there, so let me try and address them in order. One is about this Blake's ideas of contraries, which is a key part of his thinking, which I'm not a scholar enough yet to know exactly where he gets all of that thinking from, but certainly some of it is from the German philosopher, thinker, Jacob Boehm, who very much thinks in terms of contraries and the light side of God and the dark side of God and the hot side and the cold side, as them all being necessary to God's purpose, so to say. And Blake has a very similar idea that the contraries are all necessary. They serve one another. And I almost want to leave it at that level, but for now, because that is a key Blakean idea. But the problem is, if you put that idea together with New Ageism, what you get is this sense that, everything has its role, good and bad. It becomes very non-judgmental and very, very. It becomes a sort of philosophical position in which you've risen above reality and you look at the different forces in play and you say, well, they're all necessary. the whole world is necessary. Everything in the world is necessary, yin and yang, let's say. But you were saying that from a point of view outside of reality. You know, it's like you have to be yin or yang yourself. I mean, you might be different things at different times, but at any one point, you aren't standing there looking at the totality. And this all sounds a bit vague and about New Ageism, but this is part of the history of idealism, in German idealism. Yeah, Hegel was highly critical of Schelling, because Schelling's dialectics produced this idea that you could see the totality. And as Hegel put it, what it creates is what he called the dark night in which all cows are grey, i.e. you can't tell the difference between anything. And what it ignores dialectically is what someone like Adorno or Hegel, certainly Adorno's Hegel, would call the negative labour of the concept, the work of criticism, of negation, of opposition, inside this world, not outside it. And of course, Blake was fiercely partisan in so many things. He wasn't a wishy-washy hippie. And to some extent, Higgs recognises this and says, you know, it's not about not taking sides. It's about recognising that both sides are necessary. But in truth, that really draws the sting out of the ideas of contraries. Another thing Higgs does is he says that Blake was a sort of loner philosophically, that the Western philosophical tradition is all dualist, and Blake had a kind of monist position, forgetting that there was a massive growth in idealism at that time in Germany, which, you know, for example, Coleridge studied it. It's not like it's completely, you know, it's German, so it's completely foreign to us, you know. People were aware of it. And within that tradition, someone like Hegel has an idea of contraries. Hegel, by the way, is somebody who read Jacob Boehm very closely, who came himself, Hegel, from a pietist background in the same way that Blake's family did. He called Boehm the first German philosopher, right? So Hegel is someone who ran with this idea of contraries, but I would argue really understood dialectics. We're going to call them dialectics between you and I, Conor, polite. Yeah. But this idea of contraries and dialectics, understood it very concretely and in a very, let's call it a very advanced way, that's useful to know about if you want to think about Blake. Because if you don't know about it, the danger is you just end up talking about this kind of wishy-washy, you know, good and evil.
On the one hand, on the other.
Yeah, it just goes on like that forever. And in fact, I feel as though I gave Higgs a bad time over the poem thing for making a really elementary, you know, schoolboy error kind of thing. Over this, I don't feel bad about having a go at it, because his whole book was promoted with the press material said, everybody loves Blake. The Labour Party love Blake. They sing Jerusalem at their conference, and so do the Tory party. And in this divided nation, maybe Blake can bring us all together by understanding that both sides are necessary. So you're basically, and you know, as I pointed out outside of the review, so do fascists like Blake. You know, the EDL, there's a history of the EDL written by Billy Blake. You know, they nod their heads towards William Blake. Aren't we supposed to accept that everybody, you know, every position, you know, racism, anti-racism, you know, Assad and the Syrian revolution, all are necessary to the world going on? Well, no, Blake certainly didn't think that. You yourself or anybody might want to think that, but one thing that I'm pretty clear about is that is not how Blake saw things, and that's one of the reasons I would particularly took umbrage at this book. I thought it was, you know, a sort of dangerous book in that way, because it's supposed to be coming from a countercultural point of view, but in fact is selling this wishy-washy social democratic, you know, when I say social democratic, I really mean Gang of Four, SDP, you know, let's be reasonable, sitting on the fence. So that's one aspect of that business that I think is really pernicious. I call it stoner dialectics, you know, because if, like when you're stoned, you know, this kind of dialectics gives you the feeling that you can see and understand everything, but actually it's incompatible with actually doing anything or taking any time. So you know, so as I say, I called it stoner dialectics in my review. But the other question you asked, which is separate but related, is about how this idea of a world in which contraries are all necessary is connected with you know, issues of the Tao Te Ching and physics and the state of Beulah. Beulah is part of Blake's mythical geography. So he has all these areas of the universe that he talks about. So Beulah Hula, Golganuza, which is the city built in Ulan Adan, and Beulah is another of these places. And they're all symbolic of, I won't say what they're all symbolic, but they're all symbolic of various states of mind or states of existence. Beulah is a kind of dreamy state in which all of the countries do coexist, and well, they coexist. They get along without being resolved, and therefore it becomes, for Higgs, two things. One is it becomes, he says, well, that's like quantum mechanics, where, you know, the field that defines the sort of quantum state at any time contains all the positions that all exist, and therefore, in some sense, Blake is anticipating modern physics. Well, there's two things wrong with that. One is that he's not, because he's not a physicist. Blake isn't trying to describe the ultimate nature of reality, and in some ways, you know, philosophical ideas like Blake's, or ideas from, you know, from Taoism or you know, from the Vedas or whatever, can be very suggestive when you're talking about physics, because they're interesting, complex concepts that aren't everyday concepts. So sometimes they can help you understand modern physics theories, and you know, I'm fine with that. They can be suggestive, perhaps, of new theories, you know, so they can play that role, perhaps, but they aren't physics. And what I mean by that is that, just to use a slightly different example, Higgs says that Blake in several places talks about the mutability of space. He says, though, you know, you can, and of time, actually, but, you know, but when regards in space, you can have the whole of existence can be inside, you know, a pulse or something like that, inside a small space. Okay, so, and he compares that to the modern idea of the holographic nature of space, that the 3D nature of the universe is in fact an illusion, and that the universe exists in a 2D space. Now, to me, that's nonsense for the following reason. A holographic theory of space is only a hypothesis. It's not accepted as a physical theory at all. And if it were rejected as a physical theory, would that mean that Blake was wrong? Because you can't have your cake and eat it, and saying he's making predictions and statements about physics, but then if they turn out to be wrong, you know, he doesn't have to carry the consequences. Now, to me, if you say that Blake is talking about physics at that point, you're saying that if the holographic theory and similar theories of space turn out to be wrong, Blake also would have been wrong. And I think that's a massive mistake, because Blake isn't talking about physics. He's talking about the imagination and spirit. And it's important to maintain that distance, because otherwise you end up doing what Higgs does, is saying that, and there was a whole publishing industry around this, of saying that the Vedas and Buddhism and things like that anticipate modern physics. And really, you know, again, some of these things are quite suggestive and interesting, but ultimately that's ideological nonsense, right? You know, I read a great book about Buddhism and science, and the thesis of which was that Buddhists have always claimed, more accurately, have long claimed, that Buddhism is more compatible with science than other religions are. And in May, it's not a religion. And the reason for that is that you had all these Christian missionaries at the height of Western imperialism going out to the East, and they're challenging the Buddhists. And the Buddhist defense was, well, you know, in many ways it's physics, right? You know, in many ways it's like physics. It's not really a religion. But the problem with that argument is that they argued that before there was modern physics anyway. So to give you an example, if you ever read the book, it's called The Abhidharma, which is a Ceylonese work of Buddhist psychology from about the 3rd or 4th century. And I read it once, I studied it, because it's a truly mind-blowingly amazing book. And it's all about it categorizes, it's full of tables, table after table, and it categorizes every state of mind you can have into like atoms of thought. And where they really are atoms in the sense they are irreducible atoms of thought. And then it defines all the rules by which these atoms can combine. And what it is it's completely rigidly deterministic. In fact, they argue that if you achieve one chitta, which I've forgotten the name of, but this particular chitta, you are guaranteed through the mechanical working out of the laws of the mind, you are guaranteed to achieve nirvana. I think it's called something like the entry into reality chitta, you know. But if you get it, you just have to hit it once. It's like the perfect snooker shot. You just have to hit it in exactly the right place, and all the balls will go in the pockets. The point is that the Abhidharma is rigidly mechanical, and Buddhism at the end of the 19th century argued we are really in touch with modern science because we're the only people who, like modern science, are rigidly deterministic, you know. And so, you know, that's an ideological argument, and it's also an argument from the point of view of imperialism. You know, it sees Buddhism as a unified thing anyway, as if there wasn't Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana, and you know this, and ditto with Indian religion, Hinduism generally. So Higgs is quite fond of saying Hindus believe this. You know, they are monists because they believe that the Atman is the Brahman and things like this. Well, actually, you know, a lot of Hindus are materialists. Some of them are dualists. They have philosophical traditions exactly like we do. But there has been this tradition of, in the New Age of seeing other, you know, foreign religions as all the same. You know, don't these foreign religions all look the same? You know, and it's slightly, in my mind, it's slightly dismissive. And Higgs does this a lot with you know, he basically says that Blake's ideas are basically the ideas of Hinduism and of Buddhism and of the Tao and of modern physics. And then he takes all these little examples, like the quote you gave from the Tao Te Ching, which he claims. I couldn't go on, read it out again, Conor. He claims
the electron one.
Yeah.
The Tao can't be perceived. Smaller than an electron, it contains uncountable galaxies.
Now, I read this and I thought, well, obviously, you know, uncountable galaxies, electrons. I mean, atom you might have got away with, but there's no way at the time, you know, that Lao Tzu was writing about galaxies and electrons. So I just looked up, I think, you know, like 10 or more other translations, and they say nothing like that. They're not even talking about space.
No.
Smallness of the electron versus the size of countless galaxies. They're talking about completely different concepts. So actually, I feel a bit cheap again now because I think it's a bit of a cheap shot that his example is so terrible because it doesn't demonstrate any similarity whatsoever between the Tao Te Ching and in this case Blake's ideas of space. And anyway, none of these things are physics anyway. So dragging in holographic theories of space. Why this is, I suppose, relevant to the review is that the book's status as a countercultural look at Blake is partly sold on the basis that it brings in all these great wild ideas from all over the place. Well, in fact, most of the ideas I've just told you about were around in the New Age long before Blake. All he's doing is slapping those ideas from New Ageism onto Blake anyway, you know, and basically reducing Blake to the size of a sort of hippie concept of physics from 20 years ago.
Just steering you a bit more into your take on Blake, because I think, you know, I find your critiques very valid and engaging, and it's important not to encourage the counterculture to reconcile itself to the conservatives. So that is all worth saying. But also worth saying is how you read Blake. I mean, you know, I'm learning from you about how to read Blake, not rather than sort of indirectly through the criticism of the book. So just I'm interested in Beulah again. What is that about? And would you say that there is a more valuable way to consider it would be to think about something that's a concept that wasn't around for Blake, but that we have, which is the unconscious.
Oh, yeah.
Some way, is it Blake getting a sort of in touch with what we would now call the unconscious?
I think poetically, yes. I think we can say yes to that one. Is that without, I mean, as people know, you know, that some idea of the unconscious isn't completely new with Freud, but nevertheless, in a very far-sighted way, Blake is thinking about states of mind. Well, it's hard to express this because what he's thinking about is states of mind in which countries are reconciled and coexist, not reconciled. And that's got to make you immediately think of dreaming.
Yeah.
You know, when the opposites go. And then you and I, and a modern reader, are then, of course, immediately after that, thinking about the unconscious. He clearly has something like the unconscious in mind, but it's a dreamy world. And when he talks about Beulah, he at some points he talks about it being sort of dangerous because you can get sucked. It's so enjoyable, you know. He calls it a moony world, and you know it's kind of dreamlike and they're quite pleasant, and it's a necessary, perhaps, respite to sometimes visit there.
Yes.
But you know it is not your ultimate destination. Whereas Higgs tries to turn it into both an analog of the quantum world, and by analogy, therefore, an accurate description of what the world is like. Okay, because that's physics on the one hand, and also an ideal. So he tries to turn it into that. Whereas for Blake, it's nothing like an ideal whatsoever. But you're right. I didn't talk about that side of things earlier. But I think it's important to see that Blake did have a concept of Beulah. He had a concept. I mean, I feel anxious when I start talking about Blake as if he was a psychologist, because so many people do that now. But clearly, whatever he's doing encompasses psychology, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And so I don't feel that anxious about saying, you know, Blake's concept of Beulah is connected with states of being, states of mind in which, as he says, the contraries coexist.
And you get respite. I mean, I think that's very like our dreams, you know. And again, I mentioned it in another one of our talks that we talked about Jung, and I felt the respite very strongly one night. The dream offered me, and so that's exactly how I would read this place. I
was reading a book recently by a neurophysicist, but without going into that, he argues that one of the functions of dreaming is it's a practice. You're practicing various things, but without the inconvenience of having to get out of your bed and go and get your head kicked in or fall off the edge of a cliff. You're sort of, it's a kind of praxis of the mind and a kind of experience. And you can imagine in that sense, you know, world of Beulah is attractive, interesting. A respite sounds a little bit, you know.
Is it also a source of creativity? Is it a source of invention?
Yeah, he definitely thinks of it, among other things, as that. So I think it's all fine that they're, you know, to think of a state of Beulah. What is completely wrong in my mind is to idealize it as, I mean, again, stoner dialectics, not that surprising that in stoner dialectics, the ideal state is being stoned and reconciling all these, all the contraries, you know, in your mind, if nowhere else.
Now moving on to my fourth and fifth points of departure, and you've already connected to it because it's so important. Was Blake political? And obviously he was, right? But how do you know, Higgs is trying to castrate him to some extent in terms of his affiliation with French revolutionaries and so on. But perhaps you could say what you think Blake was trying to achieve, and I would like if you could, you know, reference what you think Orc was a symbol of.
Oh, terrific! I've spent the whole day reading about Orc, by the way, by a complete.
Right. Well, that's a happy.
Yes, and I was thinking if I ever write a book about Blake, I may subtitle it "The Adventures of Orc." Reasons are becoming clear, but in terms of his politics, it's as I say that he's not. I almost want to wind forward and say, why do I find Blake interesting at all? Not how did I come upon him, but what do I think? Why do I think he's useful or relevant? And one thing I think about that is that he combines. It's something we've talked about in the past. You and I have talked about experiencing punk rock and the Sex Pistols, experiencing sort of moments in time that are so transformative. And you know, from my point of view, punk rock was experiencing a moment in history in which you almost felt like the walls of reality were suddenly had become translucent, and you could almost put your arm through and touch another reality. And I'd never experienced anything like that before. I didn't know that such a thing was possible until I experienced it. But then it completely changed my life. But then if I try and describe to somebody what that is like, let's call that interlocutor a young person, they don't get it. That's like, oh, it was all made up by Malcolm McLaren. It's all, they don't, because they haven't got the experience. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought that feeling of that, it's a kind of antinomianism, a belief that, well, I won't go into what I believe it is, but it's a sort of antinomian feeling, okay? The more I thought that that's what fuels politics, it's what makes revolutionary politics possible, is the idea, some kind of sense that a completely different world is possible. But that means leaving history. It means, so to experience that is so radically transformative. And what I think about Blake is that he's someone who, he can't give that to you. Like you read a poem by Blake and dang, you'll get the experience of whatever that experience is. But what is somebody who is coming from so completely from this, again, otherworldliness. It's like it's like he has crossed the barrier and he's speaking from the other side. Okay. And the reason I thought, so in other words, Blake can provide something like the fuel of that revolutionary passion. This is what's going to lead us around to walk in the end, by the way. But that kind of revolutionary passion that I think is necessary to change the world. I'll just say today. It's been true for a long time, I think it's necessary. And what that all made me think of is the counterculture. This is how I started writing this review, because to me, the view of the counterculture of the 60s was that, and I tried to think this through, what did the counterculture really represent? And it represented a critique of, the man, of the hierarchical society. There's many other ways you can describe it, but that kind of, one-dimensional man, that kind of Marcusean view of society, but it fused it with a view of spirituality connected with that, of a view of the oneness of the world, of unity, and of all of these things. It bundled them all together. But absolutely part of that was politics. It immediately produced, not only as a 3 steps down the causal chain, it produced the new left and revival of the far left. But long before that, it produced the mass demonstrations over Vietnam, actually, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, the Paris events, all around the world, it produced ramifications that were connected with the counterculture. And it's kind of interesting to me that the counterculture today, of which I offer an example is this book by John Higgs, is radically apolitical. And it's it's removed the politics from the counterculture. So you get all the mysticism and New Ageism, but it's all flabby in that kind of that shelling sense of, we can rise above it all, and and I find that well, that's the enemy to me. I want a Blake that isn't like that at all. But there's an odd comparison to be made there between the way that New Ageism has defanged the counterculture is the same point of view that's defanged Blake and made him seem like merely a Neoplatonist or merely a Jungian psychologist. And I want to reintroduce that holistic view. I don't even like the word holistic because of these ramifications, but that rounded view of Blake as at the same moment, both radically other in terms of his spiritual view, his way of looking at the world, and radically political because of the ramifications of that spiritual view, and those being indissoluble aspects of Blake. And so clearly, to me, Blake is connected with the counterculture that didn't exist in Blake's time. But I think that, if you were going to have a counterculture in future, Blake can be an important seeding point for that, as he was for the original counterculture. Before the word counterculture even started being used, Aldous Huxley was writing really the manifestos of the counterculture. If you think of if you think of Heaven and Hell and the Doors of Perception, he's writing about a new kind of spirituality, the use of drugs at the same time, and connecting it with an anti-authoritarian view of the world, the sort of authoritarian world. And of course, the title of both books are taken from Blake. There's your manifestos for the counterculture. And then when the counterculture really takes off, Blake is again brought to the center of it by Allen Ginsberg, by Bob Dylan. And that's when he really gets cemented in the popular imagination as a popular cultural figure. But of course, since then, the counterculture has been defanged of its politics. And that's what I register in this book by John Higgs, is that it's part of that movement to take the politics out of Blake and the politics out of the counterculture. And again, not that Blake is like a load of things, one of which is politics. So I'm not just being sad about, there's missing one aspect of what Blake is, but without integrating the politics into Blake, it's not Blake. You're talking about something completely different. You're talking about Jungianism or quantum mechanics or hippie, Hinduism, but you're not talking about William Blake.
Orc?
Oh, yeah. So it's an interesting thing, you see, because one of the things that Higgs argues is that because everything is necessary to, the way he expresses it is for the world to keep going on. The contraries are all necessary. It was an interesting idea that Blake didn't want the world to go on. He was an apocalyptic thinker that had read the Book of Revelations, which in fact, the analysis of the Book of Revelations, a popular analysis of the Book of Revelations from a political point of view, was published by the revolutionary government in the English Civil War as a guide to the English Civil War. Everybody thought in terms of apocalypse and the new coming age in which you'd get rid of. It was their version of the Enlightenment. You'd get rid of the rule of the Father, which is the Old Testament, or the rule of the Son, which is the New Testament. We would enter the epoch of the rule of the Holy Spirit, where the Holy Spirit occupied each person. So it's a perfect anarchist democracy because each person spoke with the Holy Spirit. Okay, that's how Blake thought. He didn't think let's keep the whole world chundering along, which is how Higgs thinks. So because Higgs thinks that, he has a problem with Orc, because Orc is clearly a major character in Blake's mythology. So the way he ends up characterizing Orc is as a sort of necessary evil, because he's anti-authoritarian. But what happens if you let him loose is the terror of the French Republic. And because what society really needs is checks and balances and all of the contraries balancing each other, which turns out to be exactly the view of Edmund Burke in his book on the French Revolution, which founded the modern Tory party. It's one nation Toryism you're talking about here. And so Higgs's view is that Orc needs to be restrained and controlled. You need a little bit of revolution, a little bit of revolutionary passion to challenge authority, but you need to keep a tight control of it and rein it in, because otherwise, you'll get the bloody massacres of the French Revolution. And is that what you want? Because that's what will happen if you let revolution out of the bag. And that's a key point of his book. So to me, it's not a question I've come to the end of yet. There's a very beautiful line in The Tiger, Blake's best-known poem, where he talks about the stars throw down their spears, okay, in response to the tiger. David Erdman, the great political commentator on Blake, basically says that image of the stars throwing down their spears is the forces of reaction giving in. They admit defeat, and from that point of view, the poem "The Tiger" is a defense of the tiger, the wildness of revolution, not as an end in itself, because you want the tiger to go and slaughter everybody, but because you've got to have it, and then if you use it, the stars can throw down their spears, so to say. So without bottoming out the issue of Orc, I think, to see Orc as something that has to be managed. Sorry, I want to. Higgs talks in this managerial sense all the time. He talks about the different forces of the mind that Blake describes. He says you need to balance them. And so you're managing yourself now, like as if you're managing a team at work. Now you've got to manage, the Eurozenic aspect of your consciousness and the Orkin aspect. And he wants to manage revolution. He wants to manage his own mind. And it's all about this kind of modern sort of view of the spirit and psychology as mindfulness. Have a balance in your life. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Too much revolution can be a bad thing. It can lead to everything has to be carefully managed and doled out, which is a really feeble way of seeing anything to do with either Blake or the counterculture. Blake said, the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. He was not a man for carefully doling out his statements, which is why I find this book, difficult to understand as a book about Blake.
Okay.